Hello, everyone. We are now moving to our first of, I believe, will be three or possibly two. I try to keep these videos ideally around 15 minutes. Sometimes they run about 20. So two or three videos on prehistoric Japan. We're starting with the Jōmon people and primarily their magnificent work in clay. Let us turn to share my screen. Okay, we are recording. And let me just quickly do something here. There we go. So the Japanese archipelago was inhabited by at least 28,000 BC. So about, and possibly even earlier, and settlers came to the islands from mainland Asia via glacial bridges. So remembering I was speaking of the way in which human movement changes when water line drops and lowers when the Earth is in an ice age. Currently, the Earth is not in an ice age. We are warming, so our water lines are rising. When the Earth is colder, the water lines drop. And with that comes land or ice bridges, ice that forms, or even land coastal land that's very near the surface of the water becomes passable as well. So the people we're going to speak about are the Jōmon people. And the Jōmon period is considered what we call Japan's Neolithic period. That is, we're not looking at Paleolithic at all. We don't really, in this course, that is when humans were nomadic, more or less hunter-gatherers. We're looking at Neolithic, meaning New Stone Age, Neo meaning new and lithic meaning stone, when people began to settle and domesticate animals and domesticate grain and plants to some degree. And with settling, it comes the need to store food, cook food, store oils, store grains. And so pottery becomes a real hallmark of Neolithic. And you saw that early in our class when we looked at Indonesia or Southeast Asia, primarily pottery and a little bit in China. As in most Neolithic cultures in the world, the first pots were made by hand, and they tended to, presumably to be made by women. And they would, we're going to look at some examples of what kind of Jōmon pottery looks like. But before moving forward, this is in Japan, there's a real flowering of interest in reconstructing and documenting the Jōmon culture. And so this is a reconstructed Jōmon settlement based on whatever evidence we have, kind of the sort of dwellings that the Jōmon people had. Now we're turning now to principally prehistoric Jōmon, and we're going to be looking at pottery. So we're looking at a period that extends from 10,000 to 300 BC, so a very long period. The earliest fragments that we have actually are going back a little earlier than our 10,000, in fact. And these are pottery fragments from the Amori, the very far north point in Japan, that appear to date about 14,500 BC and are believed to be among the oldest yet discovered anywhere in the world. So these are just shards. Archaeologists find these clearly baked shards of of pottery, and these shards are studied, and evidence they were used to cook food can be determined. But let us move to actual vessels. And understand, not surprisingly, clay vessels deteriorate and break over time. So the term Jōmon means cord-marked design and refers to a period in Japanese prehistory during which pottery with this distinctive type of surface patterning was produced. So you can see here that a kind of woven cord has been pressed on the exterior of the pot. And we'll see also ultimately cords of clay also are wound around the pot. So there's three levels of a cord. There's the construction itself, which can be understood to be based on coils that are rolled into long kind of snake-like forms in clay and then wound to build up a container and then smoothed. And then here we're looking at a cord. You can see here, this is an actual cotton, probably, or hemp cord by this person who appears to be our dear person, has a nice little modern sweatshirt on, and she's pressing this cord into the clay to leave a kind of indentation. So you can see here, this is a fabric, the woven threads on the cord create a repetitive pattern of the cord's imprint, but we also have the cord itself as an element of structure, and then we have the cord becoming a decorative form as well. So we're dealing with three kinds of corded effects, but the earliest works that we look at, they're built out of this system of building up cords. You can kind of see a little bit here how that is, signs of that fundamental structure of the container still visible. And then along the surface, a cord has been pressed very regularly to create a textured, almost fabric or basket-like quality. Looking at 5000 BC. The term Jōmon actually means cord mark design. And so that's where we get the name Jōmon. It's such a strong presence in this culture that it's become its identifying name. And here we're looking at, please ignore that, that errant zero. It is not 25,000 years old. It is 2,500 years old. So just black that zero out. My apologies, did not see that. And here we're looking at a really energetic, very exuberant design where the corded patterns have become absolutely alive and dynamic as they move over this pot and then grow in energy and vital dynamism as we move toward the top. So this is an earthenware. This is very much a characteristic and classic Jōmon ware pot from the 2500 to 1500 BC. Another here, a little older, 3500 to 2500 BC, we see the corded impressions, and then we see this really interesting sculptural I don't know how many of you have doodled or played with cords or threads or found yourselves kind of absentmindedly working with something that has a kind of personality or character. So we get the feeling that the artist has kind of taken those long, magnificent sort of snake-like pieces of clay and just been playing with them and seeing what will happen. And we have this not particularly symmetrical, not necessarily terribly regular, but very vital and dynamic expression of a lip of this pot and handles. These appear to be some kind of handle on each side, but done in a way that's full of energy and rather exuberant, not particularly systematic or indicating an interest in kind of control and rigidity or symmetry even. So these are very one would say alive and vital because they're growing in a way that recalls the way a tree or something would grow a bit more organically. Again, these vessels are built from the bottom up, from coils of wet clay. They might be mixed with other materials such as mica and crushed shells. Then they were smoothed inside and out. And then, as I said earlier, they were pressed with cords. They would then be placed, this is a point I haven't made yet, they would be placed in a, they were left to dry, to harden, as mud will do. And once they'd hardened and dried and they were no longer wet and fragile, they would be placed in at a low temperature. They were left to dry at a low temperature, and then they would be placed in a heated container or heated system of about 900 degrees Celsius in an outdoor fire pit. So a pit that grew very hot, and then they were placed within, and through trial and error, our dear ancestors determined what's necessary to turn this clay that would wash away and erode if moisture touched it, if it weren't placed in this very hot fire pit, and then being fired becomes water. It is no longer soluble, and it becomes more or less protected from dissolving in water, and also can contain waters and oils, and becomes a wonderful container for storage of both dry and wet items. This is a pottery in the form of a flame, 3000 to 2000 BC. It's in the Tokomachi City Museum. It's a really beautiful example of this Jōmon, this cord marked style. Here we can see their vertical cords have been sort of snaked up and down, kind of like almost like a maze, or like, and then a very different effect kind of through the mid portion of the structure. And then as it moves to the top, taking on a very strong, highly varied, energetic life. With certainly some symmetry here. We can see these handles, but also an enormous amount of freedom and liveliness, as though these are living creatures snaking about and moving over the surface of this vessel. We may see some little bit of incisions as well, some shallow incisions in addition to the cords. Now, moving to a very different form are these figures. These are, we have many of these. They're known as dogu, and this is called the Jōmon Venus, no longer showing a corded pattern, but modeled in here in clay, and named a Venus, no doubt, by the scholars who at the time associated a figure that emphasizes attributes of childbearing and reproduction pretty strongly as Venus types, that is associated with fertility. This has a beautiful belly that's dropping forward and wonderfully symmetrical hips. Really interesting sign that we'll see grows dramatically as we move through the development of Japanese aesthetics. This interest in curved arced lines that become a system of patterns. And often also with straight lines. Here we see them curved beautifully and symmetrically. They're very much have these, in this case, we can see some incising on this figure's head. We don't know what the purpose of these works were, but they are probably related to a ritual of some kind. Here is another clay figurine. It's called a masked goddess, late Jōmon period. Certainly appears to be wearing some kind of mask. We have a beautiful incised designs on her body, and then these really big, full legs, suggesting that it was meant to stand. We have the vagina of this figure articulated quite clearly, but interestingly, not particularly any clearly defined breasts. The Dogu clay figurine, known as a masked goddess, is a very important example. And these figures change. So what we begin to see late in the period is they're often called goggle-eyed. You might encounter that in your reading, but these huge eyes, these huge kind of eyes that are bisected with lines, we don't know what they're meant to symbolize, but they certainly appear to have a ritual function of some kind. And the best we can do as scholars and people who care and are interested in this early Japanese culture is to become versed in recognizing these styles and then be able to locate them historically within a people. It's not clear here as this is wrapping around this figure's neck, possibly a snake eating its tail. It's hard to say. Spiraling designs, the same kind of large bulbous limbs. This is, again, these are known as goggle-eyed figures is one of the terms. It's a late Jōmon period. This is a beautiful conch-shaped clay object, absolutely exquisite. And, it really does tell us, these are people that are near the water, near the ocean, near the sea, and this vessel shaped in the form of a conch shell, and that has been colored is quite stunning. And you can see now the corded pattern being used very deliberately in imitative way to transform the shell, which may indeed have been used as a vessel, now made into its shape, made into a vessel itself out of clay. And the artist who created this seems to have a real sense of wanting those who beheld this object to kind of understand that it is wrapping around. And yet there's these wonderful contrasting curving lines that are kind of harmonizing and balancing these harder wrapping lines. So there's a whole kind of cadence or rhythm that's moving across the surface, showing artists thinking about what happens how we balance out dynamic forms. And you learned a lot about how to think this way in your first writing assignment when you looked at composition and what it means to have works that are at an angle with one another, and thought about repetition and how patterns are formed. We see all of this in this beautiful representation of a conch shell as a vessel. Here we're looking at a spouted vessel known from the late Jōmon period. Here we simply is clearly a vessel for pouring, and we have now a more incising and less laying down of cord and more cutting into the pot itself, which is an interesting question. What causes this growing interest in cutting in versus laying on? And but we recognize this as a late Jōmon vessel, and it was found in a shell mound in Ibaraki, and it's today in the Tatsuma Collection of Fine Art in Hyogo. So the Jōmon people are, these are locations. Now you have to kind of get your orientation here. Here's China, here's Korea, there's Hokkaido, there's Honshu, the island of Honshu here, Kyushu and Shikoku, which is not labeled, nor is Honshu. But these are all names here of sites, and not Hokkaido, these in all caps, of places where Jōmon artifacts have been found. So throughout the length of the islands here, we find a well-known Jōmon sites. We have found objects further north as well there, but these are the most well-known sites here. So now I'm going to say farewell, and we are leaving behind the Jōmon culture. I want to just make a couple points, which I'll repeat in the opening of the next video, and that is there's theories about who the Jōmon people were, where they came from, and their pottery style seems to reflect some of the styles that we see in Siberia. So the Jōmon people may have come down into the archipelago from Siberia. We know that the Japanese today don't ethnically link themselves so much to the Jōmon, but the culture we're returning to in our next video, the Yayoi culture, they do. So, but this foundational, deep, relatively imperfectly known culture of the Jōmon didn't just disappear. They coexisted and influenced and in unknown ways, engaged with a new culture that comes from the south that appears to have come via Korea, coming in and beginning up, but down here in Kyushu, and that is the Yayoi culture. So we will be changing to a second of three kinds of prehistoric cultures. We've just finished our first, the Jōmon, and now please go to the next video for the Yayoi culture. Sharing. So I'll see you just back shortly.